This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like Castbox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, let's dive in. Today we're tackling World War II, specifically the roles of the U.S. and Canada.
A massive topic, but our listeners sent over this fascinating lecture transcript as a jumping-off point.
Yeah, and it's not just about the major battles or a simple timeline.
Right, we're going deeper, looking for those insights that really make history come alive.
Like, did you know Canada actually declared war before the U.S.?
In 1939, 2 years before Pearl Harbor.
Wow, that's surprising.
It shows how closely tied they were to Britain through the Commonwealth, but it wasn't just symbolic.
So they were actively involved from the very beginning.
Oh, absolutely. Canadian troops were on the ground in France in 1940, facing the full force of the Nazi blitzkrieg.
That's incredible. They were really thrown into the thick of it.
They fought bravely in the Battle of France and were vital in the evacuation of Dunkirk. Imagine that chaos.
Helping to rescue thousands of Allied soldiers.
Wow.
I mean, the U.S. was still officially neutral at this point, right?
Yes, but President Roosevelt was already pushing for more support for the Allies. He saw the threat Hitler posed.
He knew the U.S. couldn't stay on the sidelines forever.
Exactly. And then there's the Lend-Lease Act, passed in 1941, even before Pearl Harbor.
Okay, so break that down for us. What was the Lend-Lease Act all about?
It was essentially a way for the U.S. to provide crucial war materials to Britain, China, and later the Soviet Union without actually entering the conflict directly.
So kind of like, we're not officially in this, but here's a bunch of stuff to help you fight.
Exactly. It was a huge risk for Roosevelt. It defied American neutrality, but it was vital for the Allied war effort.
A lifeline, especially for Britain, who were basically standing alone against the Nazis at that point.
You got it. And it shows Roosevelt's strategic thinking. He was already working to contain fascism, even with American public opinion still divided on direct involvement.
So even though they weren't officially at war, the U.S. was playing a huge behind-the-scenes role.
A massive role. And then everything changed on December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor.
A date which will live in infamy, as Roosevelt so powerfully said.
His speech after the attack was incredible. It captured the nation's shock, anger, and determination.
And of course, it led to the U.S. officially entering the war.
Declaring war on Japan, then quickly on Germany and Italy, too. Full commitment from that point on.
So Roosevelt really steps up as a wartime leader.
Yeah.
And that's where his Arsenal of Democracy speech comes in, right?
Exactly. He rallied the nation. It wasn't just about sending troops. It was about mobilizing the entire country to support the war effort.
Okay, what did this Arsenal of Democracy actually look like in practice?
Factories across the country retooling to produce tanks, planes, ships, munitions, millions joining the workforce.
Wow, a total societal shift. Everyone pitching in.
Absolutely. Farmers increasing food production, scientists developing new technologies, rationing, war bonds, a collective effort.
And this wasn't starting from scratch. The Lend-Lease Act had already laid the groundwork for this massive mobilization, right?
Exactly. That early preparation proved crucial. They could ramp up support for the Allies quickly and effectively.
It's amazing to think about the scale of it all. Roosevelt really brought the nation together to face this threat.
He did. And this wartime unity helped pave the way for the formation of the Big Three alliance: Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin.
Three incredibly powerful leaders with their own motivations and ideologies working together.
It's a fascinating dynamic. But let's shift our focus now to the Pacific Theater, where a decisive battle was brewing in 1942, the Battle of Midway.
This was a major turning point against Japan, right?
It's absolutely crucial. American admirals Nimitz, Fletcher, and Spruance led a brilliant campaign. They were able to use intelligence gathered from deciphered Japanese codes to anticipate enemy movements and set a trap.
Wait, they actually cracked the Japanese codes. That's like something out of a spy movie.
It's true, and it was a game changer. The U.S. Navy crushed the Japanese fleet, sinking 4 of their aircraft carriers and stopping their advance across the Pacific.
Wow, what a victory. But where was Canada in all of this? We've talked a lot about their role in Europe.
That's a great question. And it highlights a stark contrast in their wartime experiences. Canada's role in the Pacific was much more limited, focused mainly on the defense of Hong Kong in late 1941.
Hong Kong. I didn't realize they were involved there.
Yes, and it's a story of immense bravery, but ultimately tragedy. Nearly 2,000 Canadian soldiers were captured when the island fell to Japanese forces. Many endured years of brutal captivity as prisoners of war.
That's heartbreaking. A reminder that even within a global conflict, there are so many individual stories of sacrifice.
It's easy to get caught up in the big picture of battles and victories. But those personal stories, the human cost of war, those are important to remember too.
Absolutely. And while Canada was facing this difficult chapter in Hong Kong, the U.S., after their victory at Midway, was embarking on that grueling island-hopping campaign across the Pacific.
That's right. After Midway, the U.S. adopted a strategy of capturing strategic islands, one by one, pushing relentlessly toward mainland Japan.
Okay, but what exactly does island hopping entail?
Picture a series of amphibious assaults, each one a fierce battle for a small but crucial piece of land. Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, names that became synonymous with intense fighting, heavy casualties, the sheer determination of American forces.
Sounds absolutely brutal.
It was. The fighting conditions were incredibly challenging. Tropical heat, dense jungles, our relentless enemy. But despite these hardships, the U.S. forces kept advancing, driven by a desire to avenge Pearl Harbor and liberate the Pacific.
Each island captured brought them one step closer to defeating Japan.
Precisely. And that's where we'll pick up next time, exploring the final stages of the Pacific War and the complex legacy of both the U.S. and Canada's involvement in World War II.
So we left off with the U.S. pushing closer to mainland Japan, island by island. And it sounds like it was incredibly challenging, right?
Logistically and strategically, a real marvel.
What do you mean?
Well, each island, once captured, you had to secure it, establish supply lines, prepare defenses. It was a real grind, a war of attrition.
And our lecture transcript talks about incredibly fierce fighting, often in very difficult terrain, right?
Absolutely. Picture these soldiers battling through dense jungles, extreme heat and humidity, and an enemy often dug in, ready to fight to the death.
I mean, places like Iwo Jima, we all know that iconic photograph of the flag raising.
Weeks of brutal combat right there.
A symbol of both the struggle and the ultimate triumph. But those victories came at a huge cost.
Staggering casualties on both sides. And not just physical wounds. The psychological toll of this kind of warfare. Immense.
It makes you wonder what it was like for those soldiers, far from home, facing those unimaginable horrors.
Right. Those stories must be filled with incredible bravery, resilience, and maybe even some dark humor to help them cope.
I bet. It's those personal accounts that really bring the past to life, don't they?
Absolutely. I mean, we can understand the strategy, the troop movements, the battle dates, but it's those personal accounts that connect us to the individuals who lived through it.
I mean, imagine reading a letter from a soldier stationed on some remote Pacific island, describing the daily routines, the fear of nighttime attacks, the longing for loved ones back home.
Exactly. It adds so much to those dry historical facts. It humanizes the experience.
Speaking of different layers of understanding, our lecture transcript mentions those contrasting historical interpretations of the war, right?
Yeah, it briefly touched on terms like traditionalist and revisionist views.
Can you unpack those for us a bit?
Sure, think of them as different lenses through which we view the same event. Like traditionalist historians writing in the decades right after the war.
They were closer to it, I guess.
They often emphasize the heroic narrative, the Allied powers fighting for freedom and democracy against tyranny.
Which makes sense, right? It was a time of national unity, pride in the victory.
Exactly. But then, as time passed, new evidence emerged, and revisionist historians started to question some of those assumptions.
Okay, so they challenged that straightforward good guys versus bad guys narrative.
Exactly. They started looking at the complexities of decision-making, potential ulterior motives, the unintended consequences of actions. Things like, to what extent were economic factors driving U.S. involvement? Or was the decision to drop atomic bombs truly necessary?
Wow, tough questions.
They force us to think critically about the past, and then there are the post-revisionists.
Right. Where do they fit in?
They sort of try to find a middle ground. They acknowledge both the traditionalist and revisionist perspectives, recognizing the heroism and sacrifices, but also those complexities, the moral ambiguities of war.
They're saying, yes, there were heroes, but there are also difficult choices, compromises, maybe even mistakes made along the way.
Exactly. And by examining all these perspectives, we get a more complete understanding. It's not about finding one correct interpretation. It's about embracing that complexity and engaging with all these viewpoints.
It's like piecing together a puzzle, right? You need all those different pieces to see the full picture.
Perfect analogy. And when it comes to those pieces, We have so many primary sources that contribute to our understanding. We've talked about letters and diaries, but what about official documents, government communications, military records?
They must offer a wealth of information.
Oh, they do. They provide a more official perspective, often revealing strategic thinking, political pressures, logistical challenges faced by leaders.
And our lecture specifically mentioned Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King's communications.
Yeah, his wartime correspondence, memos, speeches, they could really shed light on Canada's decisions, their relationships with the other allied powers, those unique challenges they face balancing commitments in both Europe and the Pacific.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's bring it back to the Pacific Theater. We left off with the U.S. pushing closer to mainland Japan, island by bloody island.
Right. By 1944, after years of fighting, they'd recaptured the Philippines, a key strategic victory, signaling the inevitable defeat of Japan.
But it wasn't over yet, was it?
Nope. The final chapter was yet to be written, and it involved one of the most controversial decisions in history.
You're talking about the atomic bombs.
Yes. In August 1945, the U.S. dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, leading to Japan's surrender and the official end of the war.
It's a decision that's still debated today. On one hand, it brought a swift end to the war, potentially saving countless lives. But the devastation, the sheer scale of the destruction, it raises so many moral and ethical questions.
It does. And studying this period, understanding the context, the motivations, those long-term consequences, it's crucial. It forces us to really grapple with the complexities of war, the power of technology, the impact of these events on our world today.
Heavy stuff.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to remember that behind those grand historical narratives, there are individual stories. Stories of loss, resilience, the enduring human spirit. Like our transcript mentioned, those oral histories from the Canadian soldiers captured in Hong Kong.
Those would offer a profound and personal perspective. Imagine hearing firsthand accounts of their experiences, the struggle for survival, their eventual liberation.
It connects us to the human cost of conflict in a way that no textbook ever could.
Exactly.
Makes me think about all the stories waiting to be uncovered, all the different pieces of the puzzle that help us understand the past.
And that's what makes history so fascinating, right? It's a continuous process of discovery, interpretation, reevaluation, always something more to learn.
So as we move into the final part of our deep dive, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the lasting legacy of U.S. and Canadian involvement in World War II. What impact did it have, both for them and for the world?
That's the big question, isn't it? I mean, World War II reshaped the global landscape in such profound ways, politically, economically, socially. It's hard to overstate its significance. Where to even begin?
Yeah, so many layers to that question. World War II it reshaped everything, politically, economically, socially. Yeah, where do we even start unpacking that? Let's start with the U.S., I guess. They came out of the war a global superpower, right?
Absolutely. I mean, their industrial might, military power, economic resources, they were the dominant force, no question.
The war really boosted their economy too, didn't it?
Pulled them right out of the Great Depression, set the stage for a period of incredible prosperity.
So it wasn't just about economic power, though. The U.S. took on this whole new role as a leader in world affairs.
Totally. Shaping the post-war order. I mean, the United Nations, NATO, they were key in all of that.
And that commitment to containing communism, which we see play out in the Cold War, right?
Exactly. It really stemmed from this new sense of global responsibility.
Okay, so the U.S. emerged transformed. What about Canada? How did their experience shape their path?
Well, for Canada, the war really cemented their national identity, their autonomy. They'd proven themselves both militarily and diplomatically.
They showed the world what they were capable of.
Yes. Their sacrifices, their roles in key battles like the Dieppe raid, the liberation of the Netherlands, solidified their place among the Allied nations.
A lot to be proud of, but also those hardships, like what happened in Hong Kong, those must have left scars too.
Of course. The war's legacy for Canada, as for any nation, is complex. Triumph and tragedy intertwined. It forced them to confront the human cost of war, the resilience of their soldiers, and their place in this changing world.
Yeah, it really makes you think about all those individual stories, the personal experiences that shape lives during these huge events.
Exactly. And it's why it's so important to keep exploring those stories, to go beyond the dates and battles and really listen to the voices of those who lived through it all.
It's a reminder that history isn't just about facts and figures, right? It's about people, their lives, their choices, and how those choices continue to ripple outward, affecting us even today.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I think that's a powerful message to carry with us, to remember the human cost of war, to appreciate the sacrifices made, and to never stop seeking a deeper understanding of the past, even when it's difficult.
Well said. And on that note, a huge thanks to you, our listener, for joining us on this deep dive into the U.S. and Canada's roles in World War II. We've covered a lot of ground, but remember, this is just the beginning of your own exploration. Keep asking those questions, keep digging deeper, and keep that curiosity alive. Until next time, happy exploring.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.